Rochester, New York, December 1975. In a quiet lab, an engineer named Stephen Sasson wires together a movie camera lens, a stack of circuit boards, and a handful of batteries. It weighs almost 8 pounds. It takes 23 seconds to capture a single black and white image, and you need a television just to see the picture. It is clumsy, slow, and ugly. It is also the first digital camera ever built, and it was built inside the laboratories of Eastman Kodak, the company that had run photography as its own private kingdom for 100 years. Kodak patented the device. Then it put it in a drawer. Within one working lifetime, the company that built this machine would be bankrupt, brought down by the very technology it had already figured out how to build. But to understand how it all fell apart, you have to go back to the beginning. The story starts almost a century earlier, with a bank clerk from Rochester named George Eastman. In 1888, Eastman put a simple box camera on the market, preloaded with enough film for 100 pictures. His pitch was radical in its simplicity. You press the button, we do the rest. A customer didn't need to understand chemistry or optics. They just needed to want a picture. Send the whole camera back to Rochester and Kodak would develop the film, print the photographs, and reload it for another 100 shots. Photography, until that moment, a specialist's craft, became something anyone could do. That one idea built an empire. Eastman understood something his competitors didn't. The camera itself wasn't really the business. The camera was the door. The real business was everything that came after the shutter click. Every camera Kodak put into someone's hands became a standing order for film, chemicals, paper, and processing for years, sometimes decades. It was less like selling a product and more like selling a subscription before anyone had a word for that. The model was so effective that Kodak's dominance became almost total. By the mid-1970s, Kodak controlled roughly 90% of film sales and around 85% of camera sales in the United States. For close to 100 years, the company held more than 80% of the American photographic film market, a level of market control that would be unthinkable in almost any other industry. Kodak wasn't just a company people bought from. It was, for most Americans, simply what photography was. By 1988, that dominance had built a workforce of more than 145,000 people worldwide, spread across research labs, film plants, and processing centers on nearly every continent. Rochester itself became a company town in the truest sense, its economy, its skyline, and its identity built around the yellow boxes stacked in every drugstore in America. And Kodak's engineers were not coasting on the old formula. The company poured enormous sums into research, chasing every frontier of imaging science, chemical and otherwise. That research culture is exactly what produced Stephen Sasson's prototype in 1975. Kodak was not a company that failed to see the future. It built pieces of the future in-house, ahead of nearly everyone else on Earth. The peak, when it came, was almost fittingly enormous. In 1996, Kodak held more than 2/3 of the entire global film and camera market. It was, by any measure, one of the most dominant consumer brands the 20th century had produced. Investors saw a company printing money, literally and figuratively, from a product with no real substitute. Executives saw a business model refined over 100 years, one that had survived the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and the rise of television. Nothing in the numbers suggested urgency. Nothing suggested that the technology sitting quietly in a Kodak patent filing would, within a generation, make the entire business obsolete. The popular version of what happened next is simple and satisfying. Kodak invented the digital camera, panicked, and buried it to protect film sales. It makes for a clean story. It is also not quite true. When Sasson demonstrated his prototype to Kodak's executives, what they saw was not a product. It captured a single grainy black and white image after nearly half a minute, and displaying that image required hooking the whole rig up to a television set. There was no film to sell alongside it, no retail channel built for it, and in 1975 there was essentially no consumer market for anything like it. Home computers barely existed. The idea of a screen replacing a printed photograph in every American living room would have sounded like science fiction. Patenting the technology and shelving the consumer product wasn't obviously insane. It was a reasonable bet about timing. What's true, and what makes the story sadder rather than simpler, is what happened afterward. Sasson has said plainly that he was told the company could sell a version of his camera, but wouldn't, out of fear that it would eat into film sales. And Kodak did keep working on digital imaging in the years that followed, filing patents, refining sensors, building know-how that rivals would later depend on. The company was never technologically blind. What it lacked was the will to let that technology cannibalize the business that fed 100,000 paychecks. This is the real crack, and it wasn't a single decision made in a conference room in 1975. It was a posture the entire company held for decades. Film wasn't just Kodak's best product. It was almost all of Kodak's profit. Every dollar invested in digital imaging was, in a very direct sense, a dollar spent building a weapon aimed at Kodak's own core business. Executives who had spent careers optimizing chemical processing plants and film manufacturing lines were being asked to bet the company's future on a technology that, if it succeeded, would make those plants worthless. So Kodak did what large, profitable companies under pressure to hit quarterly numbers tend to do. It hedged. It developed digital products, but slowly, and often positioned them as complements to film rather than replacements for it. It kept squeezing profit from the film business because the film business could still deliver it. Meanwhile, rivals with no legacy film empire to protect, and later, phone manufacturers who saw a camera as just one feature among many had no such hesitation. They built digital imaging as the whole point, not a threatening side project. By the time Kodak's leadership fully grasped how fast digital adoption was accelerating, the company was no longer racing to build the future. It was racing to defend a fortress that consumers had already started walking away from. The cracks weren't a cover-up. They were the accumulated weight of a company that could see the future clearly and still could not bring itself to move fast enough toward it. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, the ground kept shifting faster than Kodak could reposition itself. Digital cameras improved year over year, becoming cheaper, sharper, and easier to use, exactly the qualities that had once made Kodak's own film cameras so appealing to ordinary consumers. Then came a second, even more brutal wave: the camera phone. Suddenly, the device people already carried in their pocket for calls and texts could also take a photo, store it, and share it, with no film, no drugstore drop-off, and no waiting. Every one of those shifts attacked the exact center of Kodak's business model. The company had never really been a camera company. It was a film and processing company that happened to sell cameras as the entry point. Digital photography didn't just offer a better camera, it deleted the need for film entirely. There was no processing to sell, no chemicals, no paper, no reason for a customer to ever set foot in a photo lab again. The engine that had funded Kodak for 100 years simply had less and less fuel to burn. Kodak did try to adapt. It built and sold its own digital cameras, at points holding a real share of that market. But competing in digital cameras meant competing on hardware margins that were a fraction of what film and processing had delivered for a century. The company was trying to replace an extraordinarily profitable business with a much less profitable one, using an organization, cost structure, and culture built entirely for the old model. It was like trying to reroute a river while still building on top of the original riverbed. The decline that followed was not a single dramatic crash. It was a long, grinding erosion. Film sales kept shrinking every year as digital adoption climbed. Processing revenue kept shrinking alongside it. The workforce that had once numbered over 145,000 people shrank dramatically as plants closed and divisions were sold off or shut down. Kodak restructured repeatedly, sold off patents and business units, and searched for a version of itself that could survive without film at the center. None of it arrived fast enough to outrun the debt and the shrinking core business at the same time. By the start of 2012, the math had simply run out. On January 19, 2012, Eastman Kodak filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, a company that had once defined an entire consumer industry, now formally acknowledging it could not pay what it owed. The filing wasn't caused by any single bad year or one catastrophic mistake. It was the final entry in a ledger that had been running in the wrong direction for 2 decades, ever since the technology born in that Rochester lab in 1975 finally became good enough, cheap enough, and common enough to make the old business obsolete. Kodak emerged from bankruptcy in 2013, but it emerged as something almost unrecognizable to anyone who remembered the company at its peak. Gone was the sprawling consumer empire of film, cameras, and drugstore photo counters. What remained was a much smaller business focused on commercial printing and imaging technology for other companies, a specialist supplier rather than a household name. Rochester, the company town built on Kodak's dominance, had to reckon with a much diminished version of the employer that had shaped it for a century. Stephen Sasson, the engineer who built that first digital camera in 1975, stayed at Kodak for decades and was later recognized for his invention, including with a National Medal of Technology and Innovation. He has spoken candidly over the years about what happened after he showed his prototype to management. Not as a bitter insider story, but as an honest account of how hard it is for a company to bet against its own most profitable product, even when the evidence is sitting right there on the table. The tempting lesson is that Kodak was blind, that its executives simply failed to see the future coming. The real lesson is less comfortable. Kodak saw the future with unusual clarity. Its own engineers built a working piece of it years before almost anyone else on Earth. The failure wasn't a failure of vision. It was a failure of nerve. A 100-year-old business built so successfully around one profitable idea that it could never fully commit to the idea that would replace it, even when that replacement was already sitting in its own labs. Every large company eventually faces some version of Kodak's dilemma. A new technology that threatens to make its most profitable product obsolete, discovered inside its own walls or just outside them. The companies that survive aren't necessarily the ones that see it coming. Nearly all of them do. The ones that survive are the ones willing to cannibalize themselves before someone else does it for them. Kodak built the future. It just couldn't bring itself to let go of the past long enough to live in it.